Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Rebecca Roberson, and I'm with the Elections Group. For those of you who are joining us at home for the first time or may not be as familiar, the Elections Group is an election administration consulting firm. We partner with state and local election officials to implement new programs, improve processes for voters and stakeholders alike. We also provide guidance, resources, and direct management support for jurisdictions. And our team's made up of former election officials and election experts from across the United States. We are so pleased to have all of you with us today for Accessibility and Elections, How to Better Serve Voters with Disabilities. So creating an accessible voting environment for all voters, but especially for voters with disabilities, is critical to ensuring an inclusive voting environment. While there are several federal laws that protect the right to vote, they include provisions for everything from providing accessible polling places to making voter registration available to all. There are still programmatic gaps, and election officials are able to help fill those. We do recognize the diverse needs of voters with disabilities, and we are excited to bring you this panel of experts to discuss important considerations, resources and tools, and even new ways that election officials can make voting more inclusive within their own communities. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I am so excited to announce our panelists for today's discussion. We have Michelle Bishop. Michelle is the Voter Access and Engagement Manager for the National Disability Rights Network. Dr. at the University of Baltimore. Matthew J. Kelly is the Absentee Voting Manager for the Franklin County Board of Elections, which is out in Ohio. And Whitney Quisenberry is the co-founder and director for the Center for Civic Design. I am going to let the panelists introduce themselves, but I do want to let everybody at home know that before we begin, the Q&A feature is actually open for attendees to ask questions throughout our chat today. We will have a dedicated Q&A section towards the end. So if you drop a question in the Q&A, we are not ignoring you. We're just waiting until the end so we can get through all of our questions in our discussion. If your question is not answered, we do encourage you to send us an email at support@electionsgroup.com, and we can follow up with you after the webinar. All right. So like I said, my introductions did not do any of our panelists justice. So we are going to go ahead and kick it over to them for some quick introductions in the same order. So I will pass it to Michelle first.
Hi, good afternoon, or I suppose good morning for many of you as well. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited about this session today, mostly because my co-panelists are all fantastic and so knowledgeable in the things that they do. I think we're going to have an amazing discussion. My name is Michelle Bishop. I'm the Voter Access and Engagement Manager at the National Disability Rights Network. I'm a white woman. I usually have very unruly curly brown hair, but my virtual background here kind of smooths it all out, so you can't tell. You can't always recognize me because I'm always wearing my signature black plastic rim nerd glasses, and my preferred pronouns are she, her, hers.
Michelle. And Catherine.
I must have been, sorry. I'm Catherine Summers. I teach in a master's program that teaches user experience design at all levels. And I have had the privilege of being involved with making voting and elections easier to use since about 2014. And I was actually introduced to voting by Whitney Quisenberry, who's here. So I'm glad to see her. I had the tremendous privilege of being involved with the Anywhere Ballot project, which was an effort to create a ballot interface that people could use with their own assistive technology. And the entire current generation of ballot marking devices have been influenced by that project. So I was really, really proud to be a part of that.
Thank you. Matthew?
Good day. I am in Columbus, Ohio at the Franklin County Board of Elections. My name is Matthew Kelly, or Matt Kelly. I started here at the Board of Elections in 2019 and was, jolted by right into a major election in 2020. So having not worked in the election world before, besides from the political side, when I was working on campaigns or doing communications work for the Ohio Democratic Party, I came back into the election world after a stint in higher education doing fundraising. So it was kind of a back and forth, but I'm so pleased to be working with the Franklin County Board of Elections and back in politics and elections again. So in the time that I've been here as the absentee manager, we've implemented a few things that we'll share later, but very happy to be here with these panelists, and I'm sure I'm going to learn some things here too.
Thank you. And Whitney?
Hi, I'm Whitney Quisenberry. I'm the co-founder and director of the Center for Civic Design. We're now 10 years old and 17 people strong. What we do, for those who don't know us, is that we work with election offices, with democracy advocates, with civic engagement organizations to make elections easier to run, to support an innovation and invite participation from all eligible voters in our democratic process. My personal history in elections actually goes back to right after HAVA, where I ended up as the chair for usability and accessibility on the federal advisory committee that writes the voting system, the federal voting system guidelines. And I think accessibility came into that very early on our very first presentation. We were sitting on the big stage at NIST, and a horrible argument broke out in the audience. And I said, someone ought to tell these people how to do accessibility right. And they looked at me and said, I think that's you, Whitney. I think that's your committee. I think that's what we're doing here. This is one of the fields where people do get sued and where it really does matter in people's lives, along with education. I'm also the author of a book, A Web for Everyone, where we tried to look at accessibility from the human side rather than so technical the way many of the accessibility books are, but to think about what it is that people need to be able to find, understand, and use the information and the tools that are out there. I'm really pleased. I'm lovely to meet you, Matt, for the first time, I think. But Catherine, we go way back working on things. Catherine has been one of our guiding lights on plain language, and Michelle, obviously, as well.
Great. Thank you all again for being here. We will go ahead and get right into the questions. We have a lot of them and I'm sure you guys have a lot to say. So first off is just generally, what are some barriers that voters with disabilities face when they are preparing to vote, and also then while they're voting? We'll go ahead and actually start with Catherine.
Okay. So my expertise, my research has really focused on the barriers faced by people who don't read well, often because of learning disabilities or sometimes just age and sight related things. And also, I have had some opportunities to partner with the National Federation of the Blind, which happens to be located in Baltimore. So we hang out and talk a lot and work together. And so most of the parts of the election that I've been involved with are instructions and signs and processes about how do you get notified about where your polling place is. How do you find it when you get there? How do you find your way once you're in? And then once they hand you some paper, do the instructions make sense? And that's true for either the voters or the election judges, which is what they call poll workers in Maryland. And they all need to be able to understand quickly and easily what it is that they're trying to do. And so, yeah. Mostly for me, my focus has always been about, can we communicate clearly what they need to do?
Thank you. Michelle?
Yeah, I think it's a big question when we talk about what barriers do voters with disabilities face, because truthfully, at any touch point that the voter has with the process of voting, there's some sort of barrier present. And part of that, I think, is because the disability community is really big and really broad. We've got data from the CDC in particular that says that people with disabilities are 1 in 4 Americans. That's a huge population, and that's big and it's diverse. And Catherine talked about this a little bit. Every disability is different, and every person's experience of their disability is different. So what is a barrier for one person isn't the same as what's a barrier for another. So they're complicated problems to solve. We also find that voting is different everywhere, right? Because everyone in this crowd knows that voting is really primarily run at the local level, a little bit at the state, and not very much at the federal level. So what options are available to voters, what they're expected to do or provide differs everywhere. So we often find that when we look at voter registration, getting to your polling place or whatever it is you need to do, marking your ballot, verifying it, casting it, tracking it after the fact. There's usually something in that process that hasn't been made fully accessible to people with different types of disabilities. So it's a big and it's a complicated question, but I think the more that we dig into our conversation today, maybe we'll come up with some broad solutions that kind of help identify and tackle each of those wherever we find them.
Yep, exactly. That's hopefully the goal. Whitney?
Well, I sort of overlap with I guess I overlap with everyone here. That's where we're all on a panel together. But I started as a usability person, so thinking about how to make it possible for people to use things. And there's an international definition for accessibility that I really love, which says simply, accessibility is usability for more people, right? For people with a wide variety of capabilities, and that we're meeting them where they are. And I think this is, we should have been worrying about this all along, but as we have so many more self-service tools on the online, we're going through something about like the airlines industry went through, when at first you would call up your travel agent and they would book your flight, and then we said, no, you can book your flight on your own. But it turned out that those booking sites weren't very accessible. They weren't very easy to use, and they have gotten better with some help from lawsuits. But so I think we're in the same place with elections, where we have online voter registration, and we're trying to get more people to use the online tools so they can find the information they need when they want it, exactly when they want it, and use it. But that means that we also have the responsibility to make sure that we're not creating pathways that only some voters can use.
They're great points as well. Thank you. And lastly, Matt?
Well, from my perspective, and I cover absentee voting, which basically in Franklin County means any voting that occurs not on election day. That means absentee by mail. It means absentee voting from our nursing home program, where we send out a Republican and Democrat the team, the pairs of bipartisan team members to nursing centers. And we limit that to just the skilled nursing facilities, where we assist folks that can't maybe mark the ballot themselves. We have a curbside voting program at our early vote center. Then we have our early vote center itself. So all these different programs. Oh, we can have the jails and the hospitals as well. So all of our programs are things that we do for the voters to increase accessibility and be helpful where we can. And I think communicating those options to folks is always challenging, and making sure that they know where those that we have resources available. And I think there's some confusion to those voters that just want to request an absentee ballot. They might be elderly, but we've got 9 different forms and 9 different titles of each form. And as soon as they see the word disability or confined, they think they're in that category. So educating our voters to what these things mean and what how they access these programs, I think, is important.
All really great points. Thank you all. In our introduction, we actually spoke very briefly about the ADA and some other federal laws that protect voters with disabilities. They also provide standards for a variety of election processes, right? So Michelle, can you talk a little bit more about NDRN and how you all can help election officials reach and even stay in compliance?
I would love to. Thank you. That is probably 90% of what I do, is show up places and say, you should call our network. So NDRN, if you don't know us, we're based in DC, but we are a national membership association for a network of organizations that were created by Congress that are federally mandated. So there are 57 of us, 1 in each of the 50 states, 1 in the District of Columbia, and each of the 5 territories. So if you're joining us today from like Guam or Northern Mariana Islands, we are there. And also, if you're doing the math and you're thinking that's only 56, you are correct. The 57th is a bonus organization in the Southwest called the Native American Disability Law Center that deals more with a very particular population and not necessarily a specific state or territory. All of these organizations, like I said, they're federally mandated. So we're everywhere. They're designated by the governor. We're also mandated under the Help America Vote Act to work on access to the vote for people with disabilities. So we're doing this work and we're doing it year round. 365, whether or not it's a major election year, we're there, we're doing this work, getting people with disabilities registered to vote, educating them about the importance of their vote and their rights when they go to vote, but also working with elections officials on things that are hard to solve. Like, I've got these polling places that are not accessible. Can they be adapted, or is there somewhere suitable we can move it to? We're selecting new polling equipment, and we want to make sure it's going to be accessible as possible for voters. We're training our poll workers, and we want to make sure we're training them well so they're prepared to provide accommodations to voters with disabilities. Those are all things that our organizations would actually love to help with. One thing that I'm surprised is coming up this early in this conversation, but I guess I shouldn't be, because it's something I'm really passionate about, is that I think we have really unrealistic expectations for elections officials. In the United States, we expect you to be experts in elections, which you absolutely are. There's nobody in the country who knows more about how complicated it is to run elections, especially all the things, right? There's like the seals that you have to like break them and seal them at night. And there's all this, like, so many steps. It's so complicated. All of that. But now you also have to be experts in things like postal mail and cybersecurity and disability access, and probably a list of 100 things. And we expect you to do it all perfectly. And I think that that's really unrealistic, but I also don't think it has to be that way. I think we can understand that you all are the experts in running elections, and then we can bring in all the other expertise to work with you. And that's really what our network does. We want to be the folks who know about disability and access, who can bring that to you. And we can work collaboratively to take your elections expertise and our access expertise and bring them together and make elections work for as many voters as possible. So we're there. We'd love to do that. I see the link for our organization in the chat. Please, you can go there and find our organization in your state. If you'd like an introduction, or you're thinking, I know those folks, but we're not exactly friends, I can help with that too. So don't hesitate to reach out to me as well. And I'd love to help build some bridges there if that's something that you're looking for.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So once states and local jurisdictions, once they contact you all, and they're able to achieve and maintain that ADA compliance, there are several additional steps that can be taken to help make voting a little bit more accessible, right? So election officials can actually enhance the physical accessibility of polling places and voting centers, to ensure that voters with disabilities can easily navigate and access these facilities. So Matt, in Franklin County, Ohio, you all did just that with your Voting at Ease program, and you also listed several others in your introduction as well. But can you talk a little bit more about these efforts?
Sure. It's really not a program per se, but we really didn't look at this expanding access or expanding accessibility as creating a program. It was more of a, hey, let's look at what we're doing right now and how can we do things better with what we have. So it's not branded and it's not well funded, and we don't have our own logo or anything. But it's just a new way to look at how we set ourselves up each election. And we bake everything into the pie from the very, very beginning. So we looked at our early vote center. And quite frankly, the thing that we did that really helped us the most was we did a mock election right before the 2020 big general election. So in August, we had our poll workers that normally work on election day come in. We had about 600 of them, and we ran them through as a stress test for our early vote center to see how we could do things better. And we've got 3 different rooms that we can use. We can use all 3 at the same time for a huge election. We can use just one for maybe a smaller election or an off-year election. But we started doing, we put little barcodes on each person and we'd scan them in so we could time how people get through the system, how many steps they take, how long it takes them to vote a ballot. So we collected all this data during the mock election. So we then could use that data to say, hey, we know we're going to have an election with a potential 30 to 40% turnout. We know we're going to use one of the 3 rooms that is 9,000 square feet rather than the 12,000 square feet one. We know we're going to need X number of machines if it's going to take a voter an average of 6 minutes to vote a ballot. So we looked at all this data and said, let's use this data to set the room up better. And while we're doing that, for people that have wheelchairs or need assistance walking or have difficulty walking, let's not run them all the way through the building. So we're designing a space that creates more steps for them. Let's design a space that creates less steps for them. So we instituted kind of a greeter program where we have someone greeting people at the door, and actually Karen uses a walker herself and a scooter, and Karen will greet the person and say, hey, if you need to sit down when you're voting, we've got a special area that we've designed so we can screen some voters there. And we've created just an ADA area that's kind of split off from our normal area, where we have 10 to 15 machines at different heights. We have accessible tables where people, if they're going to vote a paper ballot, they can use that. And we are lucky enough to have multiple machines that we can redeploy and add to the space, or add another ballot counter to the space if needed. So we kind of go through the first week of early voting and see how that design works. But like I said, just it's all in planning and how we look at things and using the data to make those decisions for us. I don't want someone who physically is in pain walking through when we have all three of our voting spaces available. I don't want them walking through all three rooms. So we design a one-way traffic pattern, and as soon as people are inside the building, there's a point where they can peel off and go to their ADA section where the machines are, and the other ones continue on to the longer walk area to the check-in stations and the machines. We have our own, it's really a self-sufficient early vote center within an early vote center for our ADA folks. And they kind of just button hook around as soon as they're in the door so they can get out of the door as quickly as possible. And that's just something we thought would be important, and we've had nothing but rave reviews since we started that program.
It's a great program. Is there anything else? This one's for Michelle, Catherine, and Whitney. Is there anything else that election officials should or could even consider regarding increasing their physical accessibility? So we've seen how they've done it in Franklin County, but any other ideas? We'll start this time with Whitney.
Well, I just want to pick on something that Matt said, which is that you include people with disabilities in your workforce. And I think that's, I think I first heard that at a roundtable at the EAC, where someone said, you know, how can I get my staff better at supporting voters with disabilities? And they're like, why don't you have some voters with disabilities on your temporary staff? Maybe not your full-time, or your full-time staff, but certainly during that. And I think the other thing that I would say is that in the Accessible Voting Technology Initiative research, one of the things we found was that as well as the polling place is set up, the real issue is the people. And making sure that your poll workers are trained in a way that makes them comfortable supporting people with disabilities. I think a lot of people want to do the right thing, and they're worried about making a mistake, and that makes them nervous, and that makes them make mistakes. So it's a sort of, it's a bad cycle. So just thinking about the voting system itself, making sure that they know how to set up all of the different options if someone needs help doing that, and that they can tell people about them if they're asked. And that they feel, like a gracious host, helping someone through the voting experience, which is really what they are. Of course, there are also lots of other things like ensuring the integrity and not giving out ballots that shouldn't be given out, but they also play a host role.
Whitney's on to something there. I gotta say, when we survey voters about their experiences, I find or talk to voters directly, I find it, if the poll workers were nice and helpful, then that polling place is getting rave reviews, right? And I'm looking at it and I'm like, they did about 3 or 4 things that were not okay from a disability rights perspective, but so long as they were prepared to be that accommodating host, it makes all the difference. It's the same thing as like the number one complaint you're always going to get from voters is if you run out of I voted stickers, right? People need that part of the experience, and the poll workers are a big part of that. But one of the things that he said in his answer originally, I think is really important, was, and Whitney picked up on it as well, talking to people with disabilities. When he talked about, someone who has pain, not walking through 3 rooms to get to where they need to be. I'm someone who lives with chronic pain. And I was like, yes, please. Thank you for thinking of that. And you might not always think of that. You might think, well, she can't do stairs, so we have this flat path. But if it's too far, that's not any better for me either. But when you bring people with disabilities into the process, they can tell you these things. You don't have to figure it out on your own or make your best guess and know. They can tell you these things. And I think that those things really make a difference. I can't say enough about poll worker training. I know it's difficult. I know we have limited resources. I know it's hard, but it truly does make a world of difference.
Catherine?
So I think mostly I just want to say, go, yes. I have one tiny suggestion that I've seen come up a lot in my own work, and that is people who have trouble seeing, not because they have a long-standing disability, but because they're older. And the people, well, they not everyone can afford reading glasses. And so, and you can't, have reading glasses, but you could have magnifiers in the polling place. And I have heard of places that do that and have found voters to be enormously grateful so that's just a tiny sort of addition.
If I could sneak in and add one more thing real quick too, because all this is like getting my creative juices flowing. I would say I hear a lot about elections officials who are doing really great things, but I don't know that the voters always know. So make sure the voters know, make sure you're getting that information out there. Sometimes I hear from really frustrated elections officials who say, we bought like this brand new equipment. It's so much more accessible than our other equipment and no one's using it. We roll it out and no one uses it. And I'm like, did you tell the people it was there? Like, what was your rollout plan to make sure that voters knew it was there, it was available to them? They maybe had a chance to interact with it before election day, so they felt comfortable using it. I think, especially like we're just talking about voters who are blind and low vision, they cannot see that machine that is sitting in the corner. They do not know it's there if there hasn't been a plan to educate it and do some PR and let people know the great things that you're doing so that they know to leverage them, and you're getting feedback from your voters about what's working and what could be improved.
Oh, it's a great story from an observation I did last year. They did have a new ballot marking device, and so they'd done that outreach and they'd done that thing. And a mother and her daughter came in. The mother was in her 90s, the daughter in her 60s, and the poll workers offered them a choice of which to use, which is what happens in Maryland. You get an equal choice. And the daughter said, oh yes, I like that. I can sit down and, I think that'd be great. I can make the text larger. And the 90-year-old woman said, oh no, I'm going to do it the way I always did it. Right. So not making assumptions about what people need. There are plenty of invisible disabilities. Vision certainly can be one of them. A white cane is a pretty obvious sign, but not everybody uses a white cane. And making sure that you're asking voters what they want, not telling them what to do.
Yeah, if I could just jump in on that a little bit. We do train our poll workers specifically to how to extend your arm and let them know that your arm's extended if they would like to grab onto your arm, and those little things. And we've discovered that that just training our poll workers on the right approach, rather than just like you said, telling them what to do or where to go. I think that's really important too, and making sure your poll workers are trained to know what really could be an offensive situation if it's done incorrectly.
Thank you all. These were great points. I do want to skip back a little bit, take a few steps back to Franklin County, Ohio again. So I think one thing that would be super helpful to reiterate for all the folks on this call is that adding the service that you added did not increase the operating costs that were associated with the early voting center. So that being said, how were you able to leverage pre-existing resources or just reallocate resources that would have already been used to help make this possible?
Yeah, sure. That's exactly what we did. We looked at, again, so glad we did a mock election in 2020 in August so we could collect all this data. That helped us with how many people we can have staffing wise, how many people are needed for this. And it helps us say, when we know we're going to have 100,000 people coming through our early vote center, because there's only one in Franklin County, Ohio, and we have 100,000 people coming through, what's our daily capacity? How many people can we vote an hour? having all of that data is great, because then I can transpose all of that into how many staff members I need. So I'm going to need X number of staff members for whatever size election. And then I just take those resources and peel them where they need to be in what locations in the building. So it's not as if I'm hiring 20 more people just to do an ADA section. I was going to hire those people anyways. It's just placement of those folks in a different part of the room. You know, we have training sessions here. We have all this pipe and drape that we split up rooms into training classes and things like that. I confiscated it all and made it all early voting material, because we can build false walls with the pipe and drape that we already have. We can take a bare room. We operate in what used to be a Kohl's department store. So so we have huge spaces, and we can create our own mini rooms and doing things with pipe and drape or stanchions that we have. So we can get really creative just using the resources we already have. You know, maybe once we get things set up, I might have to hire an additional seasonal staffer as a wayfinder. But we always budget for, you know, maybe 10%, where we might have to hire 1 or 2 more additional seasonal employees anyways during an election. So if I hire 1 or 2 that can be a staff, you know, a wayfinder on staff, that's great. Sometimes we just repurpose our departments that as soon as voter registration's done, they got 2 or 3 people sitting around because we can't register folks when the election's occurring. We repurpose our full-time staff as well. So yeah, looking at resources and repurposing where you can is very important.
You talked a little bit about your human, like your literal human resources as well. Just repurposing your staff members can make all the difference in the world, especially when you're talking about a huge early voting center like that. So thank you. We've already touched on this a little bit with all of you, but I do want to circle back and just allow for a little bit of a deeper discussion. So we are discussing vote centers and polling places. But how can election officials improve training programs, especially for those poll workers who are interacting with voters the most? So we want to ensure that they're well equipped to assist the voters with disabilities while also respecting their privacy and independence. So as someone who's worked in election administration, I've seen overeager poll workers who think that they're helping and they may not necessarily be helping. So how can election officials help bridge the gap there? And we'll go ahead and start this time with Michelle.
That's a great question. I think the single most important thing you can do is really make thoughtful decisions about all of your methods of voting in terms of how to make them as accessible as possible on their own. We know that voters have a right to vote privately and independently, and that's important for a lot of reasons. But one of them is that the more people who can vote privately and independently, the fewer of them who need any type of assistance. And I think that that's important for the voter, but that's also important, I would imagine, for the election staff, because every poll worker who has to go assist a voter probably has to stop whatever else they were doing. Unless you're a lucky jurisdiction that has a wealth of poll workers to go around, which I feel like I never hear happening. It's probably someone who's busy doing like voter check-in or something like that is going to have to stop and assist someone. And so the more people can just move through the process privately and independently, the easier I think everything's going to run on election day. But short of that, I think that a lot of it even just comes down to basic disability etiquette training being integrated, which Matthew hinted at some of those things earlier, being integrated into your poll worker training. So they know things like don't make assumptions, don't just jump in and start doing for someone, right? You ask a person with a disability first whether or not they need or want assistance. And if they do, how can you best assist them? And kind of let them give you those instructions and follow their lead, I think really goes a long way. Also, making sure your poll workers know some of the basic rights that are out there. We hear from voters a lot that they brought someone with them who they want to assist them when they go to vote, which they do have that right under the Voting Rights Act. People with disabilities and with limited English proficiency can bring the assistant of their choice. And sometimes really, like we said, well-intentioned poll workers say, no, we have to help you. We're going to send one Republican, one Democrat, and we both assist you. And it's like, that is something you should offer if someone says they need your assistance. But if they brought the person that they want with them, they have a right to have that person go with them. And I think a lot of times those things are like a simple misunderstanding. Or we hear sometimes about really dedicated poll workers being really vigilant about their curbside voting and making sure that like every person who's coming through to vote curbside has a disability. And I've verified the disability. I'm like looking in the van to make sure they have a wheelchair or what. It's like, it's you don't have to do all that and probably shouldn't. I feel like that's going to get you into some sticky situations. But a lot of times I think it's really well-intentioned poll workers who are very aware that people with disabilities have rights and a right to accommodation, and they want to do the right thing. And election day is stressful and there's a lot of moving parts to remember. So they sometimes make those kinds of mistakes. I'm also a big fan of job aids that you can have on the polling site for elections officials or for all of your staff. They're not going to remember everything that you're going to give them in training because we know you don't have enough time and resources to train them on how intricate it is to run an election day. But if they know where to find the information that they sort of remember you mentioning when they were in training a month ago, then that can make a big difference as well.
Yeah, I'll pile on scenario-based training. I know a lot of election officials do this already, but you get a little muscle memory when you get to practice something. And you get a little chance to work through, what do you do in a sticky situation? What is the right thing? What isn't the right thing? And have some group agreement on that. I think that I know a lot of election jurisdictions use this for training on things like voter ID and which voter IDs are acceptable. We could do the same thing on making sure that you know how to set up the machine and it feels like it's not, you don't have to go get the manual out for it, or if you do, you've got a quick job aid. But just making sure that anything that you can do to help poll workers walk in feeling prepared, because I think they all take it pretty seriously.
Catherine, Matt, anything to add?
Uh, uh, Michelle kind of anticipated me. I was going to lean on job aids because I had the privilege of helping Maryland revise their training materials several years ago to try to make them simpler and easier to follow along. But the truth is, you're just not going to remember much from a full day of training a month ago. Although I think that Whitney's point about muscle memory is really well taken, because that does linger. But what really will help them is to have that etiquette training. And in a perfect world, it would be someone who was on the staff who had disabilities, and could share that perspective of what it feels like to have people make assumptions about what you need and what you want. And I just wanted to point out that I think Whitney's group actually has templates for job aids that can be adapted by polling places, so that you have a quick reference sheet that reminds you of all the key steps you're supposed to follow as you check someone in, or as you reconcile the tallies at the end of the day.
Thanks for the hat tip. We actually just released a template and guide to writing your poll worker manual. And one of the ideas we have in it is that if you teach something, you should, you always sort of introduce the topic, you teach the topic, and then you summarize the topic, and that summary can be the job aid that goes out in the polling place, so that it's not something new that you're learning in the polling place. It's the same thing you've learned in training.
Yeah, I think training is really important, and I can speak to how we train folks in the early vote center. Election day training, we have 5,000 poll workers that we need to train over a month period. They've got a manual, they have training classes, they've done online sessions, and again, I like the idea of the etiquette training. I think that needs to be built into whatever we do. We do some of that, but it's not as formalized as I think we probably should have that, as well as diversity training as well. We just need to think in broader terms of the training in general, not just about this ballot goes there, this voter goes here. It needs to be about the customer service experience as well.
Oops.
Thank you all. I like the way that you framed that you want to think of it as a customer service experience. I think that kind of changes the game a little bit for folks. So one thing that I do want to do, we are running out of time a little bit. But this one isn't really a question. It's more of a topic that I would love to get more insight about, and that's plain language. So we've talked about it a little bit in the beginning. It's an effective tool for election officials who are looking to improve their interactions with voters who have disabilities. So I'd like to open up the floor about 45 to 60 seconds for each of you, to allow for you all to discuss the importance of plain language and also plain interaction for voters with disabilities. And I would love to kick it to Catherine first.
Okay. One of the questions we just skipped is, what can you do that isn't going to cost you money? And plain language is actually one of the best things you can do that won't cost you money, because you have to print all those materials anyway. So let's print them after revising them so that they use simple, familiar words. They use sentence structures that are not short is good, but the really key issue is, are the structures predictable? As people are reading them, can they predict where the sentence is going and sort of what's coming down the pike? And so using sentences that are predictable, familiar words, white space so that things don't look overwhelming, large type so that people can see it, and also so that it doesn't look overwhelming. One of the things that plain language experts realize early on is that if it looks easy to read, it's going to end up being easy to read, because people will be more relaxed and they'll be more willing to and able to tackle it. So having having white space, having big letters, having a clear visual hierarchy, all of that helps a lot. And that's things that you can do for the materials that you already have to print. Like the vote by mail materials. We just went through, and Whitney has templates. Whitney has templates. That's kind of the thing for envelopes that actually have now been tested repeatedly. And we know that voters can understand the envelopes. We know that they can understand the instructions. And so when you use those, the number of ballots that need to be cured is reduced, which is fabulous. More people get to vote.
Perfect. Thank you. Whitney, I know you have a ton of resources, and I'm seeing you putting them in the chat as well. What would you like to add?
I actually don't have much to add to what Catherine said. I think she's been someone who helped us see the difference between plain language for technical information and writing for people with low literacy. There are differences. And I think what you said about being able to anticipate what the information is a really key and important part of that. We think of plain language as sort of accessibility for content. And so when you think about not just how you write the words or how you present them on the page, but how you structure them, so that if it's in a web page or a Word document or a PDF thing, that you're using headings properly, you're using all the cells properly, that if something is a list, you've made it a list, you haven't just put a dash in front of it, because just visually those structures help people, but they also help people using assistive technology, because assistive technology can navigate those structures to say, you might say, here's how you can apply for an absentee ballot if you still have to apply for them in your state. And what someone reading a screen reader will hear is, there's a list of 5 things. And so now they know what to expect is coming down the pike in the next few seconds of that document.
Rebecca, can I add one more thing that sometimes people worry about making their materials really simple, because they think, well, what about all the rest of the voters who don't have low literacy? 43% of adults in the US read at an 8th grade level or below. So there's, nearly half of the people are going to benefit just because now they can read it, and before they couldn't. But we've also done a lot of research that shows that people with very highest levels of literacy have higher satisfaction with the simple, well-formatted, white space headings, large print materials than they did with the ones that they had before. Because none of us finish filling out a form or reading, learning something that we need to learn and say, oh gosh, I wish that had been more complicated. I wish that had taken me more time. So
just because you can read a scientific paper doesn't mean you want your election material to sound legal or sound scientific. You're there to figure out something where to go to do something, how to do something, when to do something. That's all you need.
Catherine anticipated me this time because I was going to say the same thing. I think plain language is really underrated because it's one of those things that benefits everyone. The same way I think of like curb cuts. Anytime anyone's ever pushed a stroller or dragged a piece of luggage on a curb cut instead of bumping it up a curb, you're welcome. That wasn't made for you. That was made for people with disabilities, and that's who it's legally required to be there for. But it benefits everybody because it just makes sense and it's just easier. And I think plain language is the same way. A lot of us probably overestimate our ability to read really complicated language, myself included. I look up plain language explanations of the propositions that are going to be on my ballot because, wow, those are written to confuse you. But I think that it also, from conversations that I've had with colleagues of mine who work on behalf of language minority communities, they have told me that plain language also leads to better translations into other languages. So that if you're a jurisdiction that has to provide multiple languages, you want to take your English version, put it in plain language, and then get it translated, and you're going to end up with something much better. So it really just genuinely benefits all voters.
The only thing I would say is, besides just use of plain language, our voters, because they're moving through an area or a room, visual cues are important too. And even on some documents, our newly designed in 2022 ID envelopes for an incoming absentee ballot now have highlights on them. Hey, how thoughtful. And it actually has worked. People know that the highlighted questions are deal breakers. You need to have those things filled in. So I think visual cues along with plain language can be helpful.
Well,
Can I go one more time? I'm sorry. This is my thing, and so I can't stop very well. What Matthew is saying is partly what we call plain interaction, and that doesn't get as much publicity or explanation. And so that is when you know what you can do. When you're doing something, you're doing an action like walking through the path or filling in a ballot or clicking things or answering a question on a form. So in plain interaction, you know how to get started. You know what your options are. You know what's going to happen. You know what to expect depending on the action that you take. And then when you're finished, you know what to do with the results. And those are pretty simple explanations. But plain language, when we first developed it as a philosophy, it was mostly about print materials. Now we're not just printing with things, we're interacting with them. We're putting in feedback, input and getting back feedback. And so if you can think about that as well, whether it's with visual cues or telling people what to expect, like you can do with the, like Whitney was talking about, you need to help people understand what their options are and what the results are going to be.
Great. Thank you all so much. So we are just about ready to get started with our Q&A portion. But I do have one more question. I'm going to jump around a little bit, but I do want to give this opportunity for Whitney to talk about some of the resources that have been placed in the chat as well. So the Center for Civic Design has several resources that are available for election officials who are wanting to improve or even create accessible information online. You all have information and templates for creating accessible PDFs and forms. You have Word documents and even guidance for creating ballots that can all be found on your accessible voting page. Whitney, your website has, like we said, so many helpful resources and tools. What are the main resources that you offer that election officials should look at when they're first thinking about expanding accessibility?
Their first thing about it. Well, I want to talk about accessible PDFs because it sounds like I'm going right into the nerdery section, but so much of election material is stuff that was created for print, and then we figured out how to shove it online. So we made a PDF file and we said, well, you'll print it out and you'll mail it back. But the minute we put it online, the minute we have it out there, it has to be accessible. And frankly, it has been over the years a difficult experience. We at CCD sort of avoided accessible PDFs for years because it just was so much work And so this is going to wrap us right back to costs. We were working with the state election office, and they just said, we don't know how to do this. If you don't help us, we don't have anybody else. And so we thought, okay, let's solve the problem. We went plowing through our contacts and said, who actually really knows something about this, who can help us? And that led us to someone I'm going to give a hat tip to, because he's a lot of free and available training on the web, webinars that you can look to, named Dax Castro. And he said, you guys use InDesign, right? Why are you doing these forms in Word? And we said, well, because election officials like to use Word better. And he said, you got to stop doing that. And he showed us how to set up an InDesign file so that you can finish making the notice or the form or the signage or anything you want. Press, and I'm talking about forms with interaction in them as well as regular documents. Press one button and you have your print version, and press another button and add 2 little changes you need to do at the end. And you now have an accessible PDF where it's not an overlay, it's not remediation. It's been built to be accessible from the beginning. Here's the pitch I have for all the election officials listening. InDesign is a monster program. It's a big program for professionals, and it's a little daunting to think about, but we're using about 5% of the features of that program. And so for the cost of that program and somebody who learns to use it, you can now have all of your materials be accessible from day one. So you get your voter registration form done, say, and there's a law change and you have to change some words in the instructions or add a field to the form. You can now do that in-house and still have it come out accessible at the end. Yes, you have to check it. I mean, you have to do all the good due diligence things you always do, but it gives you back control over your materials, and it means that you're not starting over every time you need to make a new version of a form. It's changed our approach to accessibility a lot, even multilingual forms, because you can go in behind the scenes in InDesign and add even tooltips in the other language. So you can do all the things behind the scenes in every language you support. And I've become a fan. I mean, I just used to like, oh, accessible PDFs, stay away. But it's not as fearsome as it used to be. I suspect the tools have gotten better in that time when I was avoiding the whole thing. But which actually goes to an important point, which is that we need better tools. You should be pushing your vendors, whether they're service vendors or tool vendors, to make sure that what you're getting is accessible. You make sure that you're getting an accessible voter registration form, that you're getting an accessible whatever else you have online, that the messages for cure forms are accessible, and that they're being thought about from the beginning, because there's no reason why anybody working in elections shouldn't be paying attention to this.
Thank you so much. So we went a little bit over into the Q&A section. We have a lot of questions that were actually dropped for you all. So we're going to try and get through as many as we can. So first up, what are best practices for CAPTCHA barriers on election websites? And whoever would like to take it, just jump in.
The best practice is don't have a CAPTCHA.
Okay.
Really, why do you have a CAPTCHA on the election website? I challenge you to think really hard about why that is. It's not the greatest tool for assessing human capabilities anyway. And if you do pick a CAPTCHA tool, again, press the vendor on what the accessible option looks like. If there has to be one, and make sure that it is truly accessible.
This question is going to be for Michelle. Does NDRN do audits at polling places with materials? I'm not sure. Do you all do audits at polling places, and then potentially do you have materials to help folks point out things that they may be missing?
Absolutely. NDRN doesn't do them directly, but the organizations in our network definitely do. So if you reach out to our organization in your state, they're typically called Disability Rights or Disability Law Center. That's something they can definitely help you with. We can come in and do accessibility audits using all the Department of Justice criteria. We love to also help problem solve. So if you've got particularly problematic polling places that are not really accessible, but you haven't found a way to fix it or a good alternative location, we'd love to come in and show you how you can, especially on a limited budget, work miracles with orange cones and duct tape to make your polling places significantly more accessible, where sometimes we can help talk a more accessible location in the immediate vicinity into serving as a polling place if that's been a problem as well. So definitely don't hesitate to reach out to our network. That's absolutely something we want to do with you.
Thank you. All right, this one is for Matt. How many registered voters are in your jurisdiction?
Yeah, I saw that. In Franklin County, we have 888,000, give or take, right now. In a presidential election, our early vote center in 2020, we voted 117,000 people in a 28-day period or 29-day period. And our largest day that we had in our early vote center was 7,200 people in, I think, a 9-hour period. And it can be stressful with that volume, but as long as we plan for it and we staff up ahead of schedule, we can deal with it. There's definitely going to be a line on the last few days, but only having one early vote center in the county, everybody flocks to us, especially during that last week.
Matthew, you should skip ahead with the questions and also describe curbside voting, I think, and how much it costs to run the mock election, because it's all sort of stuff aimed at you.
Sure, I was trying to scroll down through those, but the mock election that we did, we basically had our poll workers that we just reached out to. These are our election day poll workers. And I think I spent, because I was limited on a budget, I think I spent $2,500 on a barbecue lunch, hamburgers and hot dogs. So we voted them for a full straight hour. We ran them two or three times through the system so they could vote. These are mock voters. They voted 2 or 3 times as a different name. And it cost us basically lunch for those poll workers to help us out. But they benefited from the data and they were happy to do it. So I think that was a money well spent. And I'm sorry, what was the other question that
Curbside voting.
Oh, curbside voting. Boy, we could do a whole webinar just on curbside. Curbside voting at our early vote center. We have 10 spaces set up, stations 1 through 10, where cars pull in, and we have pairs of election workers go out to service each car. During the pandemic, curbside voting was open to basically anybody that can't or didn't want to enter the building. And when that definition expanded to anybody that was just not comfortable coming in the building, curbside exploded. And, you know, that's something I'm wrestling with every single election, especially when we have a high presidential coming up. You know, do I do 20 spaces? Do I do 14 spaces? Do I do 10? Keep it at 10. That plays into my staffing levels. People can come into the parking spaces and call a number and we'll send the team out. Usually they don't even have to call because we have people running back and forth. And we have to now create a queuing line for cars to get into one of those 10 spaces. So that takes up some parking away from voters in our parking lot. So I'm struggling with a lot of the curbside stuff because we do have some folks and we can't question them, and we don't question them whether they are eligible to be a curbside voter. But our curbside voting is intended basically for anybody that is physically unable to come into the building. Yet, and it just aggravated me when someone pulled up to curbside voting. There were 2 people in the car. When I came back with the clipboard, all of a sudden there were 6 people in the car because they went and got their friends out of the line to bring them over to curbside voting, and they were standing outside the car playing loud music, and some were dancing. And it's curbside voting is not intended to be drive-through voting in Ohio, as we don't even have drive-up voting in Ohio. Curbside's intended for a very specific audience. And when people start taking advantage of it, it just frustrates the heck out of me, as you can understand.
Thank you for sharing. So we do have about a minute left. One question that was in the Q&A I think we could probably get to is, can somebody on the panel provide their opinion about polling places or early voting locations that have a poll worker who is a designated ADA expert. So this poll worker has been specially trained on how to use the ADA voting equipment, curbside voting procedures, et cetera. Do you think that it would be beneficial? And I will open it up to anyone who would like to answer it quickly.
I think it's always helpful to have someone who's got a focus. And in many election offices, people will have specific designated roles, and that might be one of them. But I also think that it's really important that every single poll worker have basic accessibility, basic language access, basic ID training, all of those things that they're going to get questions from all voters. And if they're going to interact with a voter at all, they should have the basic sort of disability etiquette training that Michelle mentioned.
I agree with that. And I do think it's a good idea as well to have that expert, if you can have that expert on hand, who's gotten that extra training. Because one of the things we hear from elections officials is that there's so many things to train poll workers on that when it comes to training them on the equipment, like ballot marking devices, they get trained on setting it up in the morning and taking it down at night, but they don't necessarily get a really robust training on all the different features that those machines offer and everything that they can do for different types of voters. So if that's something that it's difficult to get that type of expertise for all your poll workers, but if you can get them for one in every polling place, then that person is there to kind of say, actually, you can change it to high contrast. You can increase the font. Here's how you do the audio. All of those different features that someone might need to tap into that all of your poll workers might not feel comfortable talking about or assisting voters with.
Thank you guys so much. These were great points. We are at time. I hate to rush towards the end of this, but thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everybody at home who joined us today. All of the resources that we mentioned have actually been placed into the chat, so be sure to click on those real quick before we end the webinar. A lot of questions didn't get answered. Those of you who would like to follow up, please email us at support@electionsgroup.com, and we will route you to where you need to be routed to, get you the resources that you need. So thank you so much again for joining us, and we will see everybody next time.